Admiral Vrath-Sonn had destroyed 14 fleets. This was not a boast. It was a biographical fact, the kind that preceded him into every room he entered and arranged the furniture of other people's behavior before he arrived. He had destroyed 14 fleets across 6 systems over 31 years of active command, and the combined tonnage of what he had reduced to debris was, by the calculations of his own analysts, greater than the total shipbuilding output of 3 of the species currently seated at the table. He was not a man who needed to announce his presence. His presence announced itself. He had asked for this meeting, that was important to establish. He had not been summoned, not been invited, not been requested. He had sent the communication to the human diplomatic station at Relay Point 7 and he had used the word demand in the subject line, which was not diplomatic language and which he had chosen deliberately, and the humans had responded within 4 hours with a confirmation and a location, which was either confidence or foolishness, and he had not yet determined which. The location they had chosen was a facility he did not have records for. This was unusual. His intelligence apparatus was considered among the most thorough in the known systems, and white space in his records was a condition he associated with either very careful concealment or very recent construction. The facility appeared to be the latter, new, or recently expanded, built in the outer belt of a system he had assessed as strategically negligible. The humans had suggested it with no explanation. He had accepted with no questions, which was its own kind of communication. He arrived with 3 escort vessels. This was the minimum his security protocols required and the maximum that the communication had specified. The humans had said in the body of the confirmation that they would prefer a small delegation, and he had read the preference as a test of whether he would comply with a preference stated without authority to enforce it, and he had complied. And he noted that complying was itself information he was giving them about how he read their communication, and he thought they would read it accurately. The humans who met his shuttle at the facility's docking port were not military. He had expected military. The meeting he had requested was about weapons, and weapons were a military conversation, and the humans had military. He knew their military well in the abstract sense of having studied everything he could access about it. But the 3 people who met his shuttle were not military. One was a historian. One was an engineer. One was someone whose designation in the human system translated approximately as a keeper of difficult knowledge, which was a title he had not encountered before and which he decided, upon encountering it, to treat as significant. The historian's name was Dr. Yuan. She was older than the other 2, with the particular quality of stillness that he associated in his own species with someone who had spent many years with important things and had learned to carry them without showing the weight. She greeted him in his own language, which was not in any record he had of human linguistic capabilities, and she greeted him correctly, which was rarer than competence, and she said, "Admiral, we are glad you came. We have been preparing for this conversation for some time." He said, "You knew I would request it." She said, "We knew someone would. We did not know it would be you specifically. We are glad it is." She said this without flattery in the register of a statement of operational preference. She said, "You have a reputation for precision. This conversation requires precision." He said, "What conversation?" "I requested a weapons inspection. I was under the impression the humans understood my terms." She said, "We understood your terms." She said, "Please come inside. The inspection will be part of the conversation. The conversation will be necessary to understand the inspection." He followed them inside. The facility was larger than the exterior suggested, built into the belt rock, extending inward through a series of chambers that descended in scale from the practical to the increasingly significant. The first chambers they passed through were administrative, functional, the ordinary infrastructure of a research station. The deeper chambers were different. He noticed the difference before he could have said what caused it. Something about the air quality. Something about the way the lighting was managed. Something about the fact that the personnel they passed in the corridors moved with the particular quality of people who were aware of what they were near and had made their peace with it. The keeper of difficult knowledge, whose name was Arlen, and who had not spoken since the greeting but who walked slightly ahead of the historian and slightly to the left in a configuration that he was beginning to understand. Tand was protective rather than ceremonial, stopped at a door that was more substantial than the doors they had passed before, not armored in the conventional sense, something else, something that communicated weight through means he was still identifying. Arlen said, "Before we go in, I would like to explain something about this facility and what it contains." He spoke in the trade language that served as the common medium across the systems, and he spoke carefully in the manner of someone who had explained a difficult thing many times and had refined the explanation through many repetitions. He said, "What you are going to see is not a weapons program in the conventional sense of that term. It is a record. A historical and scientific record of every weapons system and weapons concept that humanity has developed, tested, and made the decision not to deploy. Vrath-Sonn said, made the decision not to deploy. Arlen said, yes, he said. Humanity has been developing weapons for approximately 300,000 years if you include the full anthropological record. We have been developing weapons capable of interstellar scale consequences for approximately 120 years. In that 120 years, we have developed, to varying stages of completion, 47 distinct weapons systems or concepts that we assessed as capable of causing harm at a scale we considered unacceptable. He said, this facility contains the complete record of all 47. The designs, the research, the test results where tests were conducted, and the documentation of the decisions that led to each one being placed in this archive rather than deployed or further developed. Vrath-Sonn was quiet for a moment. He said, you are telling me that you have weapons you have not used. Arlen said, I am telling you that we have weapons we decided not to use. The distinction matters. Vrath-Sonn said, why does it matter? Dr. Ewan said, because not using something because you lack the capacity is a fact about your capability. Not using something because you decided not to is a fact about your character. She said, we thought you should see both. He said, I came here to assess your military capability. That is the purpose of the inspection I requested. She said, we know, we are going to show you your military capability. But we believe that capability without context produces an incomplete picture, and an incomplete picture is more dangerous than no picture. She said, please come inside. The first chamber beyond the heavy door was the historical archive. Floor to ceiling, in the physical medium that humans used for permanent records, a dense material that lasted longer than digital formats and that he had seen in human archives before were the records of the earliest weapons in the archive. He did not need to read them in detail to understand what he was looking at. The shapes of things, even in documentation, communicated their purpose. He moved through the chamber and he read titles and dates and the brief descriptive headers that prefaced each file. And what he read was a timeline of restraint that he had not anticipated and was not sure what to do with. The engineer, whose name was Dr. Foss, and who had been quiet with the quiet of someone with a great deal to say who was waiting for the right moment, stopped beside one of the records and said, may I explain this one? He said it to Vrath-Sonn directly, with the manner of someone addressing a specific interest rather than a general audience. Dr. Foss said, this one was developed 73 years ago. The project lasted 11 years and involved over 3,000 researchers across 9 countries, the human political units that existed before the consolidation. He said, the system was designed to propagate through a target body's hydrological cycle, a planet's water. Once introduced at a sufficiently distributed scale, it would alter the chemical composition of the water in a way that was irreversible through any technology available at the time of the project. The alteration would not be immediately fatal to most species. It would simply render the water unsuitable for life over a period of 3 to 5 generations. Vrath-Sonn said, a slow weapon. Dr. Foss said, we called it a patient weapon in the internal documentation. The euphemism was deliberate. One of the things this archive documents is the language that researchers use to manage the psychological weight of what they were developing. The language shifts over time. The earlier projects use more direct descriptions. The later ones, the ones from after the consolidation, after we had made more decisions like this one, use plainer language. As if the accumulated experience of deciding not to had made it easier to say what the things were. Vrath-Sonn looked at the file. He said, why was this one not deployed? Dr. Foss said it was never intended for deployment. It was developed as a deterrent. The strategic logic was that possessing a weapon capable of rendering a planet uninhabitable on a generational timeline would prevent adversaries from initiating conventional conflict, because the cost of escalation was unbounded. He said, the decision not to deploy it was made when the deterrent purpose was assessed to be outweighed by the risk. The risk was that the weapon, once developed and documented, could not be undeveloped. That its existence created a category of possible action that had not previously existed and could not be removed from the category of possible actions. He said, the researchers who built it spent the last 4 years of the project arguing for its destruction. They succeeded. This archive contains the design. The physical materials were destroyed. Vrath-Sonn said, the design remains. Dr. Foss said, yes. The decision was made that destroying the design would be less safe than preserving it here. That knowledge of this type once produced was safer inside a documented and controlled archive than scattered across the records of 3,000 researchers. He said, "This is one of the harder arguments in the archive philosophically. Not everyone agreed with it. The documentation of the disagreement is also in the archive." He said, "You document the disagreements." Dr. Ewan said, "We document everything." She said, "This is part of what I mean when I say that this is a record rather than a weapons program. The record is not only of the weapons, it is of the arguments, the calculations, the people who said yes and the people who said no and what each group believed they were protecting." She said, "We find that the arguments are often more informative than the weapons." Vrath-Sonn moved further into the archive. He stopped at records that caught his attention, sometimes because of the scale implied by the title, sometimes because of the date, sometimes because of something in the brief header that suggested a particular kind of thinking. He was a student of weapons, in the way that any admiral necessarily was, and what he was seeing in this archive was unlike any weapons record he had encountered. Not because the weapons were unlike anything he had encountered. Some of them were familiar in concept, variations on approaches that appeared across multiple species' development history, and some of them were unlike anything in his experience, products of a particular kind of human thinking that he was beginning to develop a sense of. What was unlike anything he had encountered was the archive itself. He had seen weapons programs. He had seen weapons treaties and weapons surrenders and weapons inspections and weapons capabilities assessments. He had never seen a voluntary archive of weapons decisions. A place where a species had gathered in one location everything it had built and decided not to use, and preserved not just the designs but the thinking, not just the what but the why. He stopped at a file near the center of the third chamber. The date on it was recent, within the last 15 years. The header read, "Project Continuity Status, archived by unanimous decision of the Oversight Council, year 87 post-consolidation." The brief description beneath said, "A communications disruption system capable of targeting the cognitive architecture of species with distributed neural networks." He read this header twice. He said, "This targets minds." Arlen moved beside him. He said, "Yes." He said it with the particular quality he had been using throughout, not flat, not detached, but with the weight of someone who had spent time with these records and had absorbed their weight without becoming numb to it. He said, "This was the most contested archival decision in the facility's history. The system was not fully developed. It was at approximately 40% of theoretical completion when the council voted to archive it. The vote was 12-0. He said, "The 12 members of the council at that time included the 3 lead researchers on the project, who all voted to archive their own work." Vrath-Sonn said, "Why was it contested if the vote was unanimous?" Arlen said, "Because unanimous does not mean untroubled." He said, "The contest was internal. Each of the 12 came to the same conclusion through different arguments, and the arguments were not all compatible with each other, and the documentation of those arguments is the most extensive in the archive." He said, "If you would like to read it, I can arrange access." I mention it because he paused with the precision of someone selecting words, because the arguments that were made against archiving this project were not simple arguments. They were made by people who believed they were protecting something real. The archive does not pretend otherwise. Vrath-Sonn said, "What were they protecting?" Arlen said, "The possibility of defense. There are species in the current configuration of inhabited systems whose cognitive architecture would be affected by this species with whom humanity has had in the past and more recently significant conflict. The argument for completing the project was that possessing a credible defensive capability against minds of that architecture reduced the probability of conflict by eliminating the strategic advantage that architecture conferred in certain engagement types." He said, "This is a coherent argument. It was made coherently by serious people. The council did not dismiss it." Vrath-Sonn said, "But they archived the project." Arlen said, "They archived it because the counterargument was this." He said, "A weapon that targets the cognitive architecture of a specific kind of mind is not a weapon that can be limited to conflict scenarios. It is a weapon that, once fully developed and deployed, defines a category of mind as a legitimate target." He said, "The council concluded that no strategic benefit was worth creating that category. That the harm of creating it was not quantifiable in the same terms as the benefit, and that when a harm is not quantifiable in the same terms as a benefit, the comparison is not actually a comparison. It is a category error." He said, "This was the argument that carried the vote." He stood in front of the file for a long time. He had argued in 31 years of command for weapons that he believed were strategically necessary. He had built cases for systems that cost him something to build cases for, because he was not a man who was indifferent to what he did, and the difference between him and people who were indifferent was something he had maintained with deliberate effort over a long career. He had never been in a room that was built to hold the evidence of what it cost. This room was built to hold exactly that. He said, "How many people know this facility exists?" Dr. Ewan said, "Within humanity, everyone. The archive has been public since its founding 41 years ago. The location is disclosed. The records are accessible to any human citizen who requests access." He said. She paused. She said, "The decision to make it public was one of the harder decisions in the archive's history, in a different way than the weapons decisions. The weapons decisions were hard because of what they required giving up. The decision to make the archive public was hard because of what it required admitting." She said, "We made it public because we believed that a species that keeps its restraint secret has not actually chosen restraint. It has only chosen concealment. And concealment and restraint are not the same thing." He said, "You are telling me that your restraint is a public commitment." She said, "We are telling you that our restraint is a public record." He said. She corrected. She said, "The distinction is that a commitment can be abandoned without evidence. A record cannot." He moved to the final chamber. It was smaller than the others and contained fewer files, and the files it contained were different from the ones in the outer chambers. Not different in format, different in weight. He could feel the weight before he could have said why, and he stopped in the entrance to the chamber and said, "What is in here?" Arlen said, "The ones that were closest." He said, "These are the projects that reached full development before the archival decision was made. Systems that were operational, that were tested, that existed as deployable capabilities." He said, "There are 7 files in this chamber. Each one represents a weapons system that was fully functional at the time it was archived. None of them were deployed in the context for which they were developed." He said, "The decisions in this chamber were not made in committees or research councils. They were made by individual commanders and heads of state who had the authority to deploy and chose not to." He said, "The documentation of those decisions is different from the documentation in the outer chambers. It is more personal." Vrath-Sonn entered the chamber. He walked to the first file. The date was 62 years ago. The conflict it referenced was one he knew from historical records, a war that had ended before he was born, a war that the histories described as humanity's worst, a war that had produced casualties on a scale that most species found difficult to comprehend. The system described in the file was a radiological dispersal weapon of a design that would have, according to the technical summary on the cover page, rendered the target territory uninhabitable for between 400 and 800 years, depending on atmospheric conditions. The personal documentation Arlen had referenced was attached to the back of the file. It was a handwritten note. He could not read the script. It was in one of the older human writing systems, but Dr. Ewan translated it for him, standing beside him, reading it in a voice that was quiet and level, and that treated the translation as the careful thing it was. She translated, "I have been given the order and I have the authority, and I will not do it, not because I believe we will lose without it, because I believe that the kind of victory that requires this is a loss with better paperwork. I have written this down because I want there to be a record of a decision made correctly." Vrath-Sonn said nothing. He stood in front of the file and read the translated words in his mind again and said nothing for a long time. He moved to the second file, the third, the fourth. Each one had personal documentation attached. Each one was different commanders, different contexts, different arguments, different styles of articulation. Some were formal, some were not. One was a single sentence that Dr. Ewan translated as "enough." Another was 3 pages of careful reasoning that concluded after 3 pages with the words, "and so no." Some of the people who had written these notes had won their wars without the weapons in the files. Some had not. The documentation did not distinguish between them in tone. He stopped at the 6th file. The date was 11 years ago. He knew the conflict this referenced. He had been alive for it. He had been junior command at the time, not in the theater of that conflict but aware of it, and the histories of that conflict were histories he had studied because the strategic questions it raised were questions that had shaped the doctrine he had spent his career operating under. He had not known until this moment that there had been a weapon, that a decision had been made. He had known the outcome of the conflict, and had analyzed the outcome, and had never known there was a variable he was missing. He read the cover page. He asked Dr. Ewan to translate the personal documentation. She translated, "The analysis says we win faster with it. The analysis may be correct. I have read the analysis 3 times and I believe it is methodologically sound. What the analysis does not contain is the variable that I am unable to quantify, which is this: if we win this war with a weapon of this type, we will have won a war with a weapon of this type. That fact will exist. It will exist in every future calculation made by every species that learns of it, including ourselves. I cannot model what that fact does to the future. I know that it does something. I choose the outcome I can model over the outcome I cannot. I choose to win slowly and know what I have won. Dr. Ewan said a name he recognized, a military figure, someone whose decisions he had studied, whose campaigns he had analyzed, whose strategic thinking had influenced his own in ways he could have traced if asked. He had not known this decision was in the record. He had studied this person's victories and had not known what this person had chosen not to use to achieve them. He said, "Is this person still living?" He said, "I would like to speak with them, if that can be arranged." Dr. Ewan said, "I believe it can." She said, "I will note that the request to speak with her is the first personal request you have made since arriving." She said it without emphasis, without the quality of someone marking points. The way you note a fact because it is a fact. She said, "I think it might tell us something about what in this archive you found most important." She said, "Not the systems, not the scale of what was developed. The decision. The individual decision made by someone with the authority and the capability and the reasoning that led to the decision." She said, "Yes," she said it the way he had said it, acknowledgement, not elaboration. He stood in the small chamber with its 7 files and the weight they held, and he thought about 14 fleets. He thought about the calculations that had preceded each engagement, the analyses that had demonstrated necessity, the reasoning that had been sound, and the outcomes that had followed. He thought about the ways in which those outcomes had been what the analyses predicted, and the ways in which they had produced variables the analyses had not modeled. He thought about winning and what winning cost, and what the costs accumulated to over 31 years, and whether the accumulation was in a ledger he had been keeping clearly. He said, "I came here to assess your military capability." He said, "I have a clearer picture of your military capability than I had before I arrived. It is not the picture I expected." He said, "The weapons you have developed and not used, some of them I had approximate knowledge of in the general sense that a thorough intelligence operation produces general knowledge of research programs. I did not know about the decisions. I did not know about this facility." Dr. Ewan said, "We did not conceal it from you specifically. It is public. It has been public for 41 years. He said, "Your public records are extensive and not all of them are in my intelligence apparatus's priority queue." She said, "No, I imagine not." She said, "May I ask what you will do with what you have seen here?" He said, "That requires thought." Ozia said, "Yes, we expected it would." She said, "We also wanted to ask you something if you are willing." She said, "You requested this inspection. You have been in meetings of this type before, capability assessments, weapons reviews, the formal processes by which powers take each other's measure. What were you expecting to find?" He said, "I was expecting to find what I find in those meetings. Systems, capacities, numbers that could be entered into models and used to calculate outcomes." He said, "I was expecting to find something I could use to determine whether the current relationship between your species and mine required adjustment, whether the balance of threat and deterrence was correctly calibrated, whether I needed to recommend changes to our strategic posture." She said, "And what did you find instead?" He said, "I found a different kind of number." He said, "I found 47 decisions. And within those 47 decisions, I found a quality that I do not have a word for in my own language and that I am not sure I have a word for in the trade language." He said, "The closest I can come to it is this: I found evidence that your species has been consistently and over a long time afraid of itself, not of external threats, of what it is capable of. And that the fear has not produced paralysis. It has produced this: an archive, a record of times when the fear was the correct response and the action taken in response to the fear was also correct." He said, "In 31 years of command, I have never seen that. I have seen fear produce bad decisions, and I have seen courage produce bad decisions, and I have seen calculation produce bad decisions, and I have seen all three produce good ones. I have not seen an institution built for the purpose of holding the record of the good decisions made from fear." He said, "I did not know that was something that could be built." Dr. Ewan was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It can be. It is difficult. The difficulty is not the building. The difficulty is the maintenance. The difficulty is that each new decision has to be made by people who may not share the values that built the archive, and the archive has to be strong enough to hold them toward the same conclusions anyway." She said, "We do not always succeed at this. The archive also contains records of decisions we did not make correctly. They are in a separate section. We can show you those too, if you would like." He said, "Yes, I would like to see those." She said, "We thought you might." We have found that people who ask to see the failures are usually people we would like to have longer conversations with. He said, and the people who don't. She said they usually have already decided what the archive means before they see it, and the archive confirms their decision and they leave with what they came with. She said, you are not doing that. He said, no, he said, what I came with is no longer adequate. She said, that is, I think, the correct response to this facility. She said, shall we continue? He said, yes. He paused. He said, I would also like to return, on another occasion. With more time, there are arguments in the documentation I want to read fully. There are decisions I want to understand at the level of their reasoning rather than their conclusions. Arlen said, the archive is open. For any visitor who requests access in good faith. He said, we would consider your request made in good faith. Arlen said, because you asked to see the failures. He said it simply with the same careful weight he had used throughout. He said, people who ask to see the failures are asking the right question. The right question is always welcome here. They walked back through the chambers, the small one with 7 files, the larger ones with their accumulated decades of decisions, the administrative spaces at the front that felt different now than they had on the way in. The weight had transferred. He was carrying something he had not been carrying when he arrived, and the thing he was carrying did not have a name in his language, which was one of the things about it that he thought he would spend a long time with. At the docking port, Dr. Ewan said, Admiral, there is one more thing before you go. She said, the weapon in the 6th file, the one from 11 years ago, the woman who wrote the documentation. She asked me to give you something when you came. She said she has been expecting someone like you for a few years now and she wanted to be prepared. Ewan said she was expecting someone who commanded enough and won enough and thought carefully enough that eventually they would want to see what was on the other side of winning. She gave me this for that person. She produced a small physical object, a folded piece of paper, the kind of material that the humans used for the most permanent of their physical communications. She held it out. He took it, he said, may I read it now? She said, that is for you to decide, it is yours. He ate. Held it, he said, I will read it on the transit back, he said. I find I need to be moving when I read things that require careful attention. He said, it is an old habit. She said, I understand. She said, we hope you will come back, Admiral. He said, I will come back. He said it with the certainty he reserved for things he had decided fully. He said, I have come to many facilities in 31 years to assess many capabilities, and I have always known when I left what I had assessed. He said, I know what I have assessed here. I have assessed a species that has been developing weapons for 300,000 years and has built a room to hold the ones it chose not to use. He said, I have never assessed anything like that. He said, I have many more questions than I arrived with. That is not a condition I am accustomed to, he said. I find it suits me better than I expected. He boarded the shuttle. His security detail, who had waited throughout and whose professionalism he was grateful for, were waiting inside. They departed without incident. The facility receded behind them in the viewport, and he sat with the folded paper in his hand and thought about the archive and the chambers and the 7 files in the small room and the words he had heard translated in the quiet voice of a historian who was choosing her words carefully. He thought, a loss with better paperwork. He thought, I choose to win slowly and know what I have won. He thought about 14 fleets and what knowing what he had won would have changed, and he sat with that for the full transit back to his flagship, which was several hours, and he did not open the paper until the flagship was in view. When he opened it, it was 1 paragraph. In the trade language, in a handwriting that was clear and slightly formal, the writing of someone who had written many official documents and carried the habit into personal ones. It said, I made the decision in the 6th file alone in the early hours of a morning that I was not sure I would see the end of. No one told me to make it. No archive existed yet to put it in. I made it because I had the record of people who came before me who had made decisions of similar weight and their record was sufficient. I am writing this for the person who comes to see it, whoever they are, because I want them to know that the record is why the decision was possible, not the rules. Not the authority, the record of people who thought carefully about hard things and left evidence of their thinking. That evidence is what makes the next difficult decision possible. If you are reading this, you are now part of the record. What you do next is what gets added to it. He folded the paper. He held it. He sat in his command chair on his flagship in the outer belt of an unremarkable system, and he thought about the record. About what he had done that would go into it and what he had not done, and what the difference between those 2 categories added up to and what it would add up to from here. He thought about 14 fleets and the calculations that had preceded each one and the analyses that had demonstrated necessity. He thought about the necessity of those necessities, whether each one had been as necessary as it appeared in the analysis, or whether some of them had been necessary only within a framework of assumptions that the archive in the belt rock had just quietly dismantled. He thought, I have work to do, not the work I came here to do. Different work. The kind that starts with questions rather than objectives and does not produce outputs that can be entered into models without considerable difficulty. He thought, I am not accustomed to that kind of work. He thought, I will learn. He thought, the record says it is possible to learn. The record was made by people who learned. That is perhaps what the record is for. He looked at the folded paper. He thought about adding something to the record. Not today. He was not yet certain enough of what he had decided to write it down. But eventually, when the thinking had settled into something he could state clearly, when he knew what he was going to do differently and why and what he believed it was protecting, he would write it then. He would write it carefully, in the manner of people who understood that what they wrote might be read by someone who needed it, in a moment they could not predict, in a room he might never see. That was what the record was for. He understood that now. It was not a monument. It was not a display of restraint performed for an audience. It was a tool. A thing that made the next difficult decision possible by showing that the previous ones had been made and survived and had not, in the end, cost what the arguments against them had feared they would cost. He was going to add to it, that was decided. The rest was work. He put the paper in the inner pocket of his uniform where he kept the things he carried close. He turned to his command station, the flagship. IP moved through the belt and the system and toward the transit point and the larger questions that awaited him, and the folded paper was against his chest, and the archive was in the rock behind him, and the record was open and waiting for whatever he decided to put in it. He thought, a loss with better paperwork. He thought, I know what I have won. He thought, yes. He thought, now I know what that costs and what it buys. He thought, that is enough to begin with. That is more than I had this morning. That is, he thought, the correct response to a facility like that one. To leave with more questions than you came with and the knowledge that the questions are the point. That the people who built the archive knew the questions would never be finished and built it anyway. Because an unfinished record, carefully maintained, was better than no record. And a question honestly held was better than an answer that concealed its assumptions. He had 31 years of answers that had concealed their assumptions. He had a full career of necessary necessities. He had 14 fleets in his biography and a folded paper in his pocket, and a facility in the outer belt that was public and had been public for 41 years, and that he had not known existed until 6 days ago. He thought, I have much to learn about what is already known. He thought, that is also a correct response. He thought, I will start there. The transit from the facility took 4 hours. He spent the first hour in the way he usually spent time after meetings that had not gone as anticipated, reviewing what he had observed, ordering it, identifying the points where his prior understanding had been most significantly altered. He had a system for this. He had developed it over 31 years because one of the things that distinguished useful experience from accumulated time was the practice of examining what had changed in your thinking and why. He applied the system now. The output was unusual. The number of points where his prior understanding had been significantly altered was higher than in any review he had conducted before. Not because the meeting had been long, because the alterations were deep. He had arrived at the facility believing he understood humanity's strategic posture. He had extensive data. Fleet compositions, technological capabilities, resource extraction rates, alliance structures, the particular combination of resilience and volatility that human political history demonstrated across several centuries. He had built his assessment of human strategic capacity on this data, and the assessment was sound. He was confident it was sound, but it had been built on the data of what humanity had done. He had not thought to model what humanity had chosen not to do, because species did not generally make their restraint visible in ways that could be modeled. They made their capabilities visible because capabilities were what mattered in the strategic calculations that determined outcomes. Restraint was private, unverifiable, and strategically irrelevant, except as its absence affected outcomes. He now believed this framing was incomplete. Not wrong in its logic, the logic was sound, but incomplete in its scope. Restraint that was private and unverifiable was irrelevant to strategic models. Restraint that was public and documented in a 41-year archive with accessible records and a facility that any visitor could request to enter was a different category. It was a commitment. Not a commitment in the sense of a treaty, which could be broken, but a commitment in the sense of a public record, which could be abandoned but not denied. There was a meaningful difference between those two things, and he had not had a framework for it before today. He spent the second hour on the questions he had not asked. Every professional review of a significant meeting included an examination of the questions that should have been asked and were not, because unanswered questions were information about what you had not known to look for, and what you had not known to look for was the leading edge of what you did not yet understand. The list was longer than usual. He had not asked about the process by which the archive had been made public, who had proposed it, what the arguments against it had been, how the decision had been made. He had not asked about the failures section that Dr. Ewan had mentioned, the records of decisions that had not been made correctly. He had not asked about the staff of the facility, the people who worked there, what it was like to spend one's career in proximity to 47 documented choices to restrain capability. He had not asked about the entities that were unnamed in the archive's classification system, the decisions that were not listed as weapons but that might have been, depending on where you drew the line. These were questions for his return visit. He had committed to returning, he noted during the second hour. That the commitment had been immediate and unqualified, which was unusual for him. He generally made commitments with conditions, because conditions were the mechanism by which commitments remained honest as circumstances changed. He had made this one without conditions. He examined this and decided it was accurate. He would return unconditionally, because the questions that remained required it, and because the archive was a thing he had not known existed, and now that he knew it existed, the not knowing was no longer possible, and the archive's existence was now part of his model of the strategic situation whether he returned or not. He would rather have the model accurate than comfortable. The third hour he spent with the paper. Not reading it again, he had read it twice on the shuttle and committed it to the kind of memory he used for things he needed to access quickly under pressure. He spent the third hour with what the paper had made him think about that was not directly about the paper. The woman who had written it, the commander who had made the decision in the sixth file, had been alive for the conflict he was reviewing in her documentation. She had been in command in circumstances he had studied, and she had studied people who came before her whose records had been sufficient, and those records had made her decision possible. He was now part of that chain. The record of his visit, whatever he decided to add to it, would go into a sequence that had already been running for 41 years and that would continue after him, and the thing that would continue would be shaped in some small way by what he chose to put in it. This was a different kind of consequence than the ones he was accustomed to thinking about. He was accustomed to thinking about consequences that operated through force, through the destruction or preservation of physical things, through the movement of power from one configuration to another, through the changes in the strategic landscape that followed from military outcomes. The record operated through a different mechanism. It operated through the persistence of thinking. Through the fact that a decision made carefully and documented honestly was still present, still doing something, in rooms that the person who made it might never see. He thought about this for the full third hour and did not reach a conclusion but felt the shape of the idea become clearer, the way an unfamiliar concept became clearer through sustained attention even when the attention did not resolve the concept. He was learning to hold it. He did not yet know what to do with it, but he was learning how to hold it, which was the necessary prior step. The fourth hour he spent in communication with his second-in-command, Commander Veth, who had been managing the 3 escort vessels during his time at the facility, and who was, by training and disposition, someone who did not ask unnecessary questions. When Vrath-Sonn returned to his command position, Veth's expression had contained a question that was not unnecessary, a question about what had happened in the facility that his admiral would not have emerged from looking like this. He had not asked it. He would ask it when the situation permitted. Vrath-Sonn said to his second, "We will need to revise several assessments when we return. Not urgent revisions, not changes that affect current posture, but significant revisions." Veth said, "The human capability assessment." Vrath-Sonn said, among others, he said, "I have also been thinking about our own archives, what we keep and what we do not keep, and whether the distinction reflects a considered position or simply a habit." He said, "I would like to review our archival policy when we return, not as a priority action, as a long-term undertaking." Veth said, "The archival policy has not been reviewed in my service career." Vrath-Sonn said, "No, it has not been reviewed in mine either." He said, "I find that we have been operating on a policy that was set before either of us joined and that we have not examined." He said, "That is a gap. I would like to address it." Veth was quiet for a moment, with the particular quiet of someone who had received unexpected information and was deciding how to receive it. Then he said, "Admiral, what was in the facility?" Vrath-Sonn said, "A record of decisions." He said, 47 of them at the last count and a section I have not seen yet that contains the ones that were not made correctly. He said, I am going to return to see that section. Veth said, the decisions not made correctly. Vrath-Sonn said, yes, he said, I find I am as interested in those as in the ones that were, he said, possibly more interested. The ones made correctly confirm that it is possible. The ones made incorrectly describe the conditions under which it fails. Both are necessary to understand the thing. Vrath-Sonn said, how a species sustains a commitment to restraint across time, across individuals who did not make the original commitment, across circumstances that the original commitment did not anticipate. He said, this is a problem I have not thought about before in these terms. I intend to think about it now. He said, you will find me somewhat preoccupied for the return transit and for some time after. I ask for your patience. Veth said with the dryness of a second-in-command who had worked with the same admiral for 11 years, I will attempt to manage. They transited. The flagship moved through the unremarkable system and out of it, and into the routes that led back to the operations theater where Vrath-Sonn had responsibilities and ongoing strategic considerations, and a role that did not pause because its occupant had visited a facility in an outer belt and come away with 3,000 new questions. He managed his responsibilities. He reviewed the ongoing assessments and made the necessary decisions and communicated with the commands under his direction with the competence and clarity that his position required. He did all of this. Underneath all of it, with the constancy of something that had been placed in a place where it could not be ignored, the archive occupied him. He found himself in the weeks after the visit looking at his own operational records differently. Not with regret. Regret was not a useful operational state and he had not cultivated it. With the question of what the record showed about the decisions he had made and the decisions he had not made, and whether the distinction, mapped out honestly over 31 years, would look like something he would want a stranger to read and take guidance from. He thought about the woman who had written the documentation in the 6th file. He thought about the early hours of a morning she had not been sure she would see the end of. He thought about making a decision alone, without an archive to put it in, with only the record of people who came before who had made decisions of similar weight. He thought about what it meant that she had found that sufficient, that the record had been sufficient. That she had read the record of careful thinking about hard things, and the evidence of that thinking had been enough to hold her toward the correct decision in a moment when the pressure was maximum, and the analysis pointed in a different direction. He thought, what is in my record? He meant this in the specific sense. What had he written down over 31 years about the hard decisions, the ones that cost something, the ones where the analysis pointed in one direction and something in him had pulled in another and he had made a choice that was not purely analytical. He had made such choices, he could recall several, he had not written them down. They were in the operational logs as outcomes, as decisions recorded in the format that operational logs required, without the underneath of them, without the argument, the doubt, the reasoning that had moved him from what the analysis said to what he had done. He began writing them down. Not as official documents, he did not have a facility to put them in, did not have an archive, did not have a process for this kind of record in his own institutional context. He wrote them in the manner of someone beginning a practice without a clear endpoint, because the practice was clearly necessary and the endpoint could be determined later. He wrote about the 3 decisions in his career that he had made against the analysis, and for reasons he had not documented at the time. He wrote about what the reasons had been. He wrote about whether the decisions had been correct, as far as he could assess them now with the benefit of time and outcome. He wrote about what had made the reasons feel sufficient in the moment, because the sufficiency of a reason at the moment of decision was different from the sufficiency of a reason assessed afterward, and both were informative. He sent a communication to the facility, not to the archivists or to Dr. Ewan or to Arlen, to the woman who had written the documentation in the 6th file. He sent it in the trade language in a formal register with the acknowledgement that she had anticipated his visit and that the paper she had sent had produced exactly the response it was designed to produce, and that he was writing to ask whether she would be willing to correspond, not officially, not through any institutional channel, personally. As 2 people who had made decisions of similar weight and whose records were both, in their different ways, incomplete. She responded in 3 days. The response was short and it was direct and it said, yes. It said, I have been waiting for someone from outside our systems to read that file and respond the way you did. I was not sure it would happen in my lifetime. She said, I have questions for you too. She said, the archive was built by humans for humans and the record it contains is a human record. That is a limitation I have thought for a long time. About what a record that crossed that limitation would look like, she said, perhaps we will find out. He thought perhaps we will. He thought, this is the work I was not doing before. He thought it is the correct work. Not instead of the other work, the strategic work, the command work, the work that his position required and that he would continue to do with full attention and competence. In addition to it, underneath it. As the thing that over time changed the quality of all the other work by changing the framework within which the other work occurred. He thought about the archive in the outer belt and the chambers and the 7 files in the small room. He thought about the historian's voice, level and careful, translating words written in a script he could not read. He thought about the quality of the air in the deeper chambers and the way the personnel had moved and what that movement had told him before he understood what he was seeing. He thought about 47 decisions and the 120 years of capability development they represented, and what it meant that a species had built a room to hold all of that and made the room public, and called it a record rather than a monument. He thought, I will add to this record. Whatever I add will be shaped by what I found there. What I found there will be in it, even when what I write does not mention it explicitly. That is how records work. Each edition is shaped by what came before and shapes what comes after, and the thing that persists across all of it is not the individual entries but the quality of attention they were made with. He would bring that quality. He now understood, always had some version of it, the quality that had made him look at the analysis and feel the pull of something the analysis did not model in those 3 decisions he was now writing down. The archive had not given him the quality. It had given him a framework for understanding what he already had and a record of others who had it and had used it well. That was not a small thing. That was, he thought, a considerable thing. That was what records were for. He kept writing. The flagship moved through the systems. The record grew incrementally by the weight of things carefully described. He thought about the woman in the early hours of an uncertain morning, writing down that she would not do it, that the kind of victory that required this was a loss with better paperwork, that she wanted there to be a record of a decision made correctly. He thought, I will be part of that. However it develops across whatever time and distance and circumstances, I will be part of that record. The decision of what to add to it was his. He was making it carefully. He would keep making it carefully. That was the only thing the record asked of anyone. That was enough. That was perhaps exactly enough. 6 months after his visit to the facility, Vrath-Sonn submitted a revised strategic assessment of humanity to the council that oversaw his operational theater. The assessment was 40 pages longer than his previous submissions of this type, and the additional pages were not additional data. They were additional framework. An account of a category of information he had previously omitted from capability assessments, the category of documented restraint, and an argument for why the omission had produced incomplete assessments and what correcting the omission required. He did not expect the council to adopt the framework immediately. He submitted it because it was accurate, and because accuracy was the standard by which he evaluated his own work, and a standard that was not applied consistently was not a standard. The council's response was a request for clarification on 3 points, which was the response of a body that had read the submission carefully and found the points of genuine ambiguity. He wrote the clarifications. The exchange produced over several months a document that was not the assessment he had submitted but was informed by it, and the document was adopted as a supplementary analytical framework for capability assessments in his theater. It was a limited adoption. It was a beginning. He corresponded with the woman from the 6th file throughout this period. The correspondence was irregular. Neither of them had time for regularity, but consistent in the sense that it continued, that each communication produced a response, and that the responses accumulated into something that was, over time, a genuine exchange. She had questions for him about his operational history that were the questions of someone who had thought carefully about decisions made under pressure and wanted comparative data. He had questions for her about the archive that were the questions of someone who was trying to understand an institution he had not known existed, and that had turned out to matter considerably. She told him in one of the later communications that the archive's founders had debated for several years before making it public, that the argument against had been the obvious one, that public disclosure of the weapons systems described in the archive, even archived systems, even systems whose physical materials had been destroyed, created risks that outweighed the benefits of transparency. That the argument for had been the one that carried the vote, which was this: the archive existed to document a commitment to restraint, and a commitment to restraint that was concealed was not a commitment. It was a private hope. Private hopes did not produce the kind of accountability that made commitments durable across time and changing circumstances. Only public records did that. And the risks of the public record were real, but were outweighed by the risks of the alternative, which was an institution built on good intentions with no mechanism to hold itself to them. He thought about this for a long time. He thought about institutions built on good intentions with no mechanism to hold themselves to them. He thought about whether his own institution had such mechanisms and where they were strongest and where they were weakest and what could be done about the weaknesses. He thought about the archival policy review he had initiated and what it had produced so far and what it needed to produce to be worth the effort. He thought about the record he was building and whether it had the quality that made records useful, the quality of honest attention, of saying what was actually true rather than what was convenient or flattering or consistent with prior positions. He thought this is the long work, not the 31 years already done. The work that comes after that is shaped by what the 31 years produced and directed towards something the 31 years had not been directed toward. He thought, I am not accustomed to long work without a clear objective. He thought, I will learn, he thought. The record says it is possible to learn things you were not trained for if you approach them with sufficient attention and sufficient honesty about what you do not yet know. He thought that, at minimum, I have.